Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Lovely to have you here with us today. We're very excited, of course, to have the opportunity to speak with you around the unlocking of AI's potential in healthcare. And today, for the next hour, we're going to have this discussion with a particular focus on the legal and clinical areas of healthcare. So it really is for me and for all of us, of course, a pleasure and a privilege to be joined by the esteemed professors Regina Barzilay and Professor Glenn Cohen. Very lovely to have you with us here today for this conversation and to dig deeper into some of these critical areas regarding AI in healthcare. So without further ado, let me pass the baton over to Regina. Regina, would you like to share some of the key insights, some of the core elements that you see at play with AI in healthcare in the clinical area today?
Thank you, Paul. And again, hello, everybody. So I'm a professor of computer science and electrical engineering at MIT, and I also lead Jamil Clinic for Machine Learning and Health at MIT. And I've been working in this space close to a decade. And I work both on clinical AI, and I also work a lot in the pharmaceutical space on early discovery and on, how do you design new drugs, how you test the drugs, and how do you do clinical trials to test the drugs. But I think it's really an interesting time in the clinical AI area. So as we all know that AI as an area completely got transformed from pure academic discipline to something we're using every day in our life. But what's happened in the clinic, it's quite distinct. If you're thinking, even not as a professional, but as a private citizen, how much AI do you see when you go to a hospital to see your doctor? You very rarely see AI, if any. And there were many studies that demonstrated that AI still didn't really penetrate healthcare system. The positive news, however, that we see that every year these tools are getting more and more commonly used. Again, the absolute value of how much of the tools are there is still small, but the derivative where we are going, it's really increasing. So now we're in the inflection point when, again, this tool will become reality both in the hospitals and in pharmaceutical companies where the adoption is much broader already. Now, when I'm talking to my collaborators across the world who are typically clinicians, there are many different attitudes of, how do I bring AI in? So there are some people who expect that when they bring AI in, it's going to be like, using a phone. You don't really need to understand much about the phone. You can just use it after maybe 1 minute manual. On the other hand, there are people who feel that they need to do their own design and own retraining and really go into the technology development. So what you need is really somewhere in between these two extremes. It will depend on the needs of your organization and the goals, how you're planning to utilize AI. And the goal of this course is actually to provide you with the tools that would enable you to make the right decisions for your organizations. And again, our goal is not to teach you nitty-gritty details about, how to build the next expansion of, language models, but really how to take all this broad set of tools and technologies available and to enable you to think how to bring this technology, what are the important considerations and what you should be watching for when you are bringing it in, and how you can evaluate whether it actually helps your organization to become more effective in its goal. So this was our idea on how we designed this class. Again, I see both my collaborators in pharmaceutical industry and in the hospitals. Based on their questions, this was our driving force when we created the class. So at the beginning, we will teach you the very basic of machine learning, and the idea to give you high-level principles of, what does it mean machine trains? What does it mean you test the machine? How do you create training data? When using a language model like LLMs is not enough, why you may need to do your own training. And we will kind of touch upon the question that I always get: how much training data do I need? How do I know that it's a good data, that it's not biased data? So the first part of the course would really focus on these technologies, and we will particularly discuss, what are the most recent advances in large language models, LLM, and how we can safely bring them to our industry. So after we cover these basic fundamentals, we would actually look at some studies of how researchers did bring in these technologies into their organizations, and what were the red flags, or alternatively, good things that they learned from this experience. And there is already some emerging data of great successes, and at the same time great failures, and we really want to learn from the past to ensure that we are not making the same mistakes again. And for those of you who've seen it with ChatGPT and other tools, today we know that AI tools can make predictions that human mind cannot do. Like sometimes a machine can look at the images and the genetic data and make predictions that no doctor or no human expert would be able to make. So the question would be, how do you live in this new reality that we cannot use our own mind to kind of validate what machine is doing? How do we set up, a system where this deployment is not only effective, but also at the same time, is safe? How do we monitor it if just our eyes are not sufficient or our mind is not sufficient? And in the class, we will cover all different types of data that we see in healthcare, looking at the cells and proteins and molecules, to clinical records, which is in text, and categorical data where different tables about the patients, as well as images. And images come in all different modalities, from like big images like CT scans or mammograms to images of cells. So we will see how with this technology we can process all these different types of data with very concrete examples, which will be provided by clinicians and leaders, hospital leaders who really had a chance to implement this technology. And with that, I want to introduce our very, very popular professor in the course, Professor Glenn Cohen from Harvard Law School. And I just want to say, before I would let Glenn continue, that the whole area of regulatory landscape for clinical AI is developing very fast. And, one way to think that we actually need to wait until it comes and it finalizes. But another way to think that we can actually be co-creators of where this field moves now. But of course, the first thing to do is to understand exactly where we are and what are the considerations. So I would like Glenn to take the baton.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me today. So I'm a professor at Harvard Law School. I'm also an ethicist, and so people often bring me in, whether they're multinational pharmaceutical corporations, small startups. They bring me in to kind of help pressure test the way they're thinking about something and then give them advice about how to try to do it better. And today, I'm just going to say a little bit about some of that work related to AI and some of the stuff we cover in the course. Before I do, I thought maybe just to level set, like what kinds of technologies are we talking about? Let me just give you a couple of examples I've encountered in the real world. One is, using AI to look at results from colonoscopies to try to determine, malignant or benign. Another is an in vitro fertilization and IVF. There's a wide range of variation of follicle stimulating hormone that women are given early on in a cycle. And the idea is, could we actually tailor that to the needs of a particular woman? In mental health, we've got chatbots that are already being deployed, some of them are general use chatbots, to give interactive conversation tools for people with depression. Some of those cases have actually already ended in tragedy. We've got one lawsuit going on against Replica AI right now related to that. And then, something we're seeing very commonly that I've written about and talked about a lot is ambient listening or scribing in the hospital system. Last year, you probably wouldn't have seen it very much. This year, you'll probably see it a lot. When you go to see your general practitioner, they'll say, can I turn this thing on? They'll turn it on, it'll record the conversation, it'll transcribe, it will summarize, and then it comes back to the clinician for notes. and has a very good reason to do it. You know, if anyone has ever had a conversation with their doctor, they know the doctor is like half the time typing, half the time looking at you, and it's a very poor way of communicating, especially about something sensitive. So this is a wonderfully promising technology, but like all these technologies, raises a lot of interesting legal and ethical issues. I can say more about that during the Q&A or after if we have time. So just to kind of focus us on the kinds of things I tell people to look for and how to approach this, I often describe there to be 4 phases of building and implementing medical artificial intelligence. It's, you know, different from the way it's actually built, but from when you're thinking about it from a legal and ethical perspective, I think it's a useful enough simplification and rubric. The first is just to say, when you start with data, where did you get the data? You have to acquire the data from somewhere. And among the issues that comes up quite frequently is how de-identified or pseudonymized the data has to be. Have I stripped enough identifiers? What are the rules in the US, HIPAA? What are the rules in Europe, GDPR? What is the rules elsewhere in the world? What is the ethical best practice? So how do I make sure the data is relatively private? How representative is the data set I'm using, and is it fit for purpose for the context I'm using it? You're training something to look at moles on skin to determine whether you need to see a dermatologist. And to use a famous example, you're training data as largely Caucasian individuals, but your deployment space is South Asian or Black people. As a result, you're going to get poor results. And that's just one of the many ways in which bias can creep into the system. In some ways, that's the easy form of bias to conceptualize, missing data bias. But there are many other kinds of kinds of bias, like label bias, for example, that we talk about. We try to get people to focus on, both in terms of building, but also on the back end in terms of testing. And then we also have questions about governance. Who gets to make decisions about new uses of pre-existing data that were collected for another purpose? All that's just getting the data. Okay, you've got the data. Now you're trying to build and validate a model. How do you know when a model is well enough validated that it's appropriate to deploy it in human beings, right? Who's going to be doing that validation? What does your internal system of validation and testing and bulletproofing this sort of stuff look like, versus when do you have to worry about regulatory review regarding the AI system you're building, and who gets to decide? How do you balance between a desire often to be transparent on the one hand, to encourage trust, to allow people to build off your innovation, versus on the other side, the need potentially to protect your trade secrecy, since patents don't protect algorithms very well in this country or in Europe, and also the idea of making your AI system more susceptible to adversarial attack, which is something you want to avoid. A great study done by some colleagues at Harvard Medical School showed how you can perturb a pixel or two in a scan naked to the human eye. The human eye can't detect it, and yet suddenly now you're labeling cancers as benign or malignant when they are the opposite. So that's pretty scary and may run counter a little bit to your desire to be transparent. And also related to questions about interpretability and explainability and what the best practices and how well to design for this. Then you've got your model, and now you're ready to deploy it in a real world setting. What, if anything, are you going to tell patients about the use of this model? Are you required to have informed consent as a matter of law, as a matter of ethical best practice? What should that process look like? And are there areas where that process itself might cause you not to want to deploy? Then what I'm perennially asked about, and I talk a lot about in the course, is liability, right? I'm a lawyer, so of course, first thing people ask me is, how can I get sued? Who's going to sue me and what's going to happen? So here, what's interesting is there's lots of different kinds of liability. Can physicians who rely on an AI, who go with it, be sued? Can physicians who decide not to go with the AI, but we have that in the record that the AI recommended a different decision, will they be subject to higher liability? What about hospital systems? As purchasers and implementers of this, what kind of liability do they face? What kind of standards do they have? What about developers of AI? Can they be sued on products liability or their theories? And how does all of this relate to one another, right? So thinking about how these different liability pieces relate to one another, as well as the use of contract, for example, between an AI developer and a hospital system to reallocate liability. And what about the medical malpractice insurers and other kinds of insurers? What do they do if one of these risks materialize? Okay, then you've cleared all those spaces. So you've got an AI that is good, it's doing well, you're implementing in real live people. And now the question is, what about dissemination? And this is more of an ethical principle, but how do we ensure the principles of justice are satisfied and that we can achieve broad dissemination? If patients from across America or even across the world contribute their data and the AI is built and trained on that data, what obligations do we have in terms of licensing, pricing, distribution, access agreements to make the AI available? And now that we've done all of this, so you've made it to the end of the race, guess what? It turns out that that just means it's good when you start it. Much of the AI we use in healthcare is adaptive, is learning on the go. So what are the appropriate points to check in? How do you make sure it continues to be good? And what obligations do you have? So that's just a kind of quick overview about the way I think about this. And we get to go in depth about all of these things in the course. Let me throw it back to you, Paul.
Well, thank you, Glenn, and thank you, of course, Regina. As I listen to you both speak, I'm kind of reminded almost of the fact that kind of here in my left hand, we have all of this promise and potentiality of AI, of machine learning, of deep learning into generative AI, perhaps the most capable technology toolkit we've ever had. But then on this other hand, we have the perils of how we actually apply this, how we actually bring everything into practice in a safe, sustainable manner that allows all of us in our independent organizations, in our respective organizations, but also broadly in society, to almost create a rising tide that lifts all boats. And then as I think about the program that we're kind of referencing, I've heard Glenn and Regina talking about the program Transforming Healthcare with AI, a program that we're next running towards the end of October, of course. But as I think about that particular program, I kind of think, well, isn't it interesting? Before we went live here this morning, we actually were talking about the makeup of the participants that we have here, all of you, coming from so many different backgrounds, so many different areas, so many different functional kinds of responsibilities. And it makes me think almost of, imagine each one of you, just kind of roll with me here for a minute or two. Imagine you're kind of walking down a street in New York, perhaps, and in front of you have a skyscraper, as there are lots of them there. And as you look at this skyscraper, you might imagine the capability of AI, the potentiality of AI, residing on something like the 85th or the 90th floor of that building. However, in reality, the way in which we're building AI and using it in our products, our services, our portfolios, the way that we work, the way that we think today, probably isn't on that 85th or 90th floor. It's kind of somewhere further down, isn't it? And so in this program that Regina and Glenn kind of are working upon, we actually have the opportunity to create an elevator. We're kind of helping almost move from the AI models. I was listening to Regina talking about the flow of the program. As we move from the AI models, we're actually creating in the program an AI mindset that actually allows us to optimize the AI impact. So over the space of the flow of the program, we're actually going on that journey where we're linking the models to the mindset to the impact, but for your individual realities, not the one that Glenn works with necessarily, or Regina or myself or any one of us, but the reality that fits your patients, your customers, your clients, your stakeholders. So very exciting kind of opportunity as well. And it also strikes me that listening to my friends here speaking about the patterns that we need to recognize, patterns of success and failure, we can go back in history a little bit and look at some of the economic kind of data. If we accept that AI is arguably defensively a general purpose technology, why not look at the impact of previous general purpose technologies? Look at the introduction of electricity, the electrification of industry back 1870s, 80s, 90s, et cetera. When we look at the actual data, one of the things that's very striking is that the significant productivity impact wasn't recognized straight away. In large accounts, it was recognized decades afterwards. And so we look at that pattern, and what do we think? What do we learn? How do we actually pressure test our thinking, Glenn, with regard to this this new range of AI kind of introductions? Well, we think about the ways in which we can compress or shorten that time to impact. With the severity and the opportunity that we have in front of us, we don't want to wait decades for the impact. We want to force kind of the optimization forward as best we possibly can. And so by actually combining these areas of the clinical insights that Regina is sharing with the work that kind of Glenn is doing as well, we have every opportunity to reduce that decades-long kind of route to impact, make it shorter so that we can benefit the people who need it most. So very, very exciting times. So everybody, we're so pleased to have you here with us today. As we said at the beginning, it's an opportunity for a conversation, for a discussion. So please feel free to put your questions or a comment into the chat box, and we'll kind of do our best. We'll endeavor to kind of answer some of your kind of key questions. Let me have a little look here, and I'll, if it's okay with you, Regina and Glenn, I'll kind of direct the questions to you as they come in. The first question I have here is actually built on, it's interesting, built on something that you were both talking about in terms of how we should be thinking and acting with AI today. So in terms of thinking and acting, what's the type of mindset, Regina, that you think we should be employing when it comes to the clinical opportunities? And then Glenn, I'll turn it to you in terms of the ethical or kind of legal aspects.
So I think that, it really, the success here is correctly matching the AI capability today with what you want AI to achieve. Glenn gave example of one of the first big successes of adoption of AI is, taking notes. We know that it takes a lot of time of clinicians to do documentation. They don't like it. Significant literature shows contributes to clinician burnout. The doctor really wants, to spend more time with the patient. That's what we want. But until very recently, we couldn't really do it. The technology in natural language and speech recognition was not good enough. So right now, what we are getting from the existing tools is the capacity to do it almost perfectly using automatic tool. And then, the doctor needs to review and sign it, which of course takes much less time than like writing and recording everything. It also gives much more systematic approach to documentation. So this is a great way when, both clinician and the patient are aligned that it will be a good advancement. And even if there are some mistakes, we can tolerate them because at the end, the clinician needs to review it and sign up. But imagine to yourself, you're going to be now applying AI to predict, who needs to get chemotherapy, extremely invasive treatment, and the accuracy, underlying accuracy of AI, let's say 75%. Would you be comfortable to take this treatment? And we're talking about features that are, AI that cannot explain itself. So this may be the case where jumping in and utilizing AI is not a great idea. So that's why we very carefully need to understand, what it actually can do, what 75 maybe tested on a different population means on my population, what degree of risk we can take, and how it's going to impact the whole clinical pipeline. And also there is, of course, not maybe in the case of chemotherapy, but there is also a very important component of cost. As we know today, and this was very broadly documented, that across all the areas of medicine, we are giving care sometimes to people who don't really need it, while missing a lot of patients who do need it. So, for instance, for resource allocation, we've had an example of imaging and scanning, like my own research is in the area of predicting breast cancer risk on the images. Today with AI, we can very accurately identify patients, both in breast and lung, who are very likely to develop disease in the very near future. So in this case, the outcome would not be go and give these patients chemotherapy, but maybe scan them in higher resolution modality or call them more frequently. But we can identify a very small subset population that needs it, but at the same time, let 95% of people maybe not to be screened so regularly. So this is again the case where, the accuracy is already good enough, where even the machine made the wrong prediction one way or another, it is not really going to be a detrimental outcome for the patient, and the costs and saving across the system are substantial. So this is one of the goals of the course, is to look at different scenarios and look at all different ways how, it impacts, patient outcomes, safety, efficacy, the cost, and make the right decision. We are still not, unfortunately, at the point where we can apply AI blindly across the whole pipeline. But again, if we are careful, we can do the very good pairing between the problem and the question and the technologies that is currently available.
Wow, excellent insights, Regina. Thank you so much. Glenn, kind of over to you to kind of answer the same question around how we should be thinking of AI in healthcare from a legal perspective. And then I have to warn you, I have a follow-up kind of part B to the question from one of our kind of one of the cohorts here with regard to liability. So I just want to get you ready. I think you knew it was
Great.
coming. But
Okay, yeah, I got that now. A lawyer will to ask people being sued. Okay, so first question, right? Just quickly answer 3 kind of bullet points, I would say. One is just the highest level. I often tell people they should think about hiring an AI rather than buying an AI in terms of the mindset. You know, when you add a new person to your team, a new physician or a new member of your executive team, you know, you look at their references and you're like, oh, they went to the school, they were trained at Harvard or MIT, right? That's the training data. But you think about a lot of other things, including importantly, how they're going to work with other people who are part of your team, how they're going to be integrated, how the implementation is going to go, and how you're going to evaluate them both early on and long term. And I think that mindset is really important for AI. That's not like buying a piece of hardware and then never worrying it again. It's instead thinking very purposefully about how you're organized and how you're going to implement. Okay, that's the first point. Second point is you mentioned, Paul, these cycles of innovation. And I think often about MRIs or CT scans, this will relate to the liability question in a second, is just to say that new technologies enter practice all the time. For a period of time, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what the right standard of practice is, as to whether their use is optional, mandatory, whether you'll be sued if you don't use it. Over time, they become the bread and butter, right? These days, you come in and they think you have pneumonia, right? Typically, they will do an x-ray. There was a period of time where they would just listen, right? Or they just observe you. And what I think is interesting is that as these technologies come in, understanding how they work is great, but understanding and believing that they work is even better, which is to say, I think understanding mechanisms is useful, but actually having evidence that they're going to actually improve the thing you want and rigorous evidence. Happily, medicine is a space where that is the bread and butter of medicine. Okay. The last thing I'll just say is, and we'll switch to liability in a second, there's a risk also of going too slow. And that's a weird thing to say. Let me give the following real example. If you don't build internal access to large language models, right? So a firewalled version that's not reporting out to OpenAI or cloud or to whoever, right? And you're just running, you don't run that. Guess what? When your 25-year-old residents and medical students are doing on their phones, they're writing things into ChatGPT, and the things they're writing are going to have all sorts of identifying information about the patients and maybe about your business practices. So as you think about, gosh, do I really want to build one of these, or do I need to do this? You also have to be aware of the possibility that you're dealing with a population, both of patients and physicians, who are going to increasingly be using these tools outside your ecosystem. So really, it's a question about how comfortable you are with that, if that's the alternative.
So Glenn, kind of just switching on to the liability kind of question as well, focused onto the liability question. We have a comment from Jeffrey, one of our kind of participants here, around why wouldn't the liability lie with the physician, as AI is just another tool that the physician uses, such as a book. And so I think the context for this is around a situation where an AI system might contribute to a misdiagnosis or a treatment error, et cetera, et cetera. So any insights you'd like to share with regard to where the liability might sit?
Absolutely. First of all, great analogy on that question, right, to Jeffrey. Here's what I'll say. So first of all, notice, by the way, that the fact that the liability sits on the physician doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't sit on other people as well, right? And then you might have a choice of who to sue. So I'll just put that out there up front. There is this real issue. Once you ask the AI for a recommendation for decision support, that answer that you're given is part of the record. And currently, I think you're absolutely right, Jeffrey, that you're going to be judged as a physician based on what the standard of care would be in your field in medicine. So what would the average physician do? I actually think that the liability system is stacked in a way that it discourages currently, if anything, AI adoption for the following reason. When the AI tells you to do the thing you were going to do anyways, you're like, beautiful, the most brilliant AI I've ever met, and you go ahead and do that, everybody's happy. But when the AI tells you to do something that's not the standard of care, so let's say a higher dose of a chemotherapeutic agent for a patient, for example, now if it turns out the patient is injured by this recommendation, you might be liable for violating the standard of care. So there's a way in which, in the current moment, what you should do is follow the AI when it tells you to do what you would have done anyways, ignore it otherwise. That is a hugely depressing reality if that's the kind of behavior it incents, because it means reason why we're buying these AIs and building them is because we think they can spot cases where the standard of care is not appropriate for a particular patient. So there's a way where the current liability rules are stacked against what the optimal use is. So that's the bad news. The good news, I can tell you, some colleagues of mine, Michelle Mel and Neil Guha, they've got a great paper in the New England Journal of Medicine where they go through every reported case since I think like 2000 involving AI in medicine. It sounds like a lot of work, but it turns out there aren't that many reported cases. And the ones we do see on a variety of theories, whether it's against hospitals, developers, or physicians, have typically not found liability. Now, the last thing I'll just say on this is, though, there's a future coming where the failure to adopt AI might itself be a violation of the standard of care. And to return to my example of an X-ray or a CT scan, if you were like, well, I just looked at the patient, right? Whereas the standard of care is do the CT scan, do the MRI, do the X-ray. Now you might violate your standard of care by failing to use AI. But law tends to be slow in getting there because we have a lot of respect under malpractice law for the distinguished minority.
So I just wanted to add to it 2 points. The first one is relates to what current tools can do. So right now, if you're using AI, it would give you a prediction, and it will give sometimes probability of prediction. But sometimes if you give to it like totally different things, let's say you are trying to do this risk assessment on mammogram, and instead of mammogram you give a picture of your cat, many tools would try to make a prediction. They will predict something, maybe with low probability. So one of the things that's happening now in AI, and we're going to talk about it in the class, is really this type of models which enable the model to abstain. You just say, I don't know. This is up to clinician or another source to decide. And if you are following Glenn's example on, imaging, like for instance, we know that for certain type of tissue, for instance, for dense breast, we know that mammograms may not be extremely effective. And there is alternative pipeline that if you say, this patient, their mammogram doesn't look very clear to me, you can either do it, for instance, with contrast, or the standard of care would be to use ultrasound and other things. So as more we are going to be seeing this technology adopted, on one hand, the technology would come with some kind of guarantees, the same way as your car tells you, there is a red flash, you shouldn't be driving it. On the other hand, there will be more kind of guidelines. What do you do when you are not sure, what signal does AI give to you? So we are moving towards this reality, which is not quite there, but it's increasingly going in that direction. And again, talking about Glenn's example, that we know that technology is not perfect, but we can always think about how well does a doctor do. And maybe it would be a surprise for some of you who are not working in radiology, but we know that for 30% of patients who are diagnosed with breast cancer, if you look a year early on their image, the cancer was right there. So we are not comparing with ideal world. We are comparing with the current medical practice. As many of you know that it's one of the most common reasons of death, mistakes by the clinician. And the question that we are asking, whether the clinician with the technology can do better than clinician without technology. And as the standard of care changes, I hope we will see more and more this combination to become standard.
Fascinating insights from you both, and it's kind of great to have kind of a view of the deliberate critical thinking that sits behind the effective adoption of the technologies. It's almost as if we're building a kind of human and machine kind of double helix here, where we're taking kind of and optimizing human capabilities to get the best out of the technology as well. So fascinating. We have a broader question here, and I have to say thank you as well. The questions are coming, flowing in thick and fast, so we've got a lot to work with here. But a broader question around the impact, or the huge impact from Gelson, around the huge impact that AI is having on medical education. Is there anything you'd like to comment, Regina, upon the educational kind of dimension of how we address kind of the opportunities and the challenges with AI today?
So one of the bigger challenges to adoption is the fact that even today you can graduate medical school in the United States without taking any AI class. It is still the case. You may take classes in statistics, but not in AI. You may decide on your own that you want to study it or to take it as an elective. So I hope it is going to change. But what we see many students in this class and online classes that we are teaching are actually clinicians who want to learn and to understand how this technology works. So we're kind of in this transition period when the students, meaning the doctors and people in pharmaceutical company, understand that they're lacking the knowledge, but it will take a while to formal education, which sometimes lags behind, to make it a standard. And some programs like MIT has HST program, which prepares MD PhD, this becomes part of the classroom education, but it's still not a widespread practice in medical schools around the world.
And Glenn, from your perspective, I'm fascinated to kind of hear what you think about the way in which we should be addressing the educational requirements of how we think and act ethically, responsibly, regulate in a good regulatory way with AI.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So here's what I'll say is that if people think what we need is, it would be great if lots of people had lots of expertise and the ability to build. That would be fantastic, but I think that's unrealistic, and that's not really what we need as a first order. What I think we need to do is train people to be good evaluators, or even one step removed from that, good evaluators of the right ways to get someone else to evaluate an AI, right? So to understand what are the kinds of things we should be looking for, even if they're never going to build an AI system, and even if they're not themselves ever going to run it through or train on data or try a new verification set or do any sorts of tests on bias. But just to understand where are the pitfalls and what do I need to plan around? And when someone is selling something to me, what do I do to kick the tires? And the idea that, like I said, it's like employment, it's also like a marriage, in that, until you get divorced, which is you shut it off, you give it back, you no longer pay for it, which you might have spent a lot of money, so you're relaxing to do that. You're going to be with this AI for a long time. It's going to be in your system. And oh, by the way, you're going to be introducing lots of AIs interdigitating with one another. And that's why, as you said, the double helix, or I like the idea of a centaur, right? Half man, half horse, right? This idea of the ways in which these things interact are incredibly important, because we know from the studies there are some instances where AI plus human in the loop, does better. There are instances, though, where when you add the human into the loop, actually it does worse than either the AI on its own or the human on its own. And the fragility of those results and the importance of thinking about that in the implementation is like an important part of the commitment of trying to do this kind of work.
Again, kind of really fascinating kind of insights from you both. Now, we're going to touch upon the next topic, or based on the question from Manuel, is around the data, some of the data considerations. And I know this is a massive topic, and I know that we kind of go into it in more detail in the program as well. But I'd ask kind of Regina and Glenn for your view on Manuel's kind of observation here around applying a wider lens approach, looking at data management, data collection, data governance processes in different countries, whether it be the EU bloc or kind of perhaps even China, collecting all the population DNA data and having strict policy laws. For example, in the US with regard to HIPAA. Just really, are there kind of some base considerations you can share around how we might think on a global or kind of regional basis around the data systems that we need to employ to be effectively working with AI technologies?
So I would not talk about the legal parts of it, but I just want to tell that somebody who develops AI system, we already know, and I developed these tools in my lab, and the same is true for pharmaceutical company, that now there are some really big data brokers and big data lakes from which everybody are kind of drinking the data and training their system. Just to give you one example, is UK Biobank, that used very broadly both in academia and in pharmaceutical companies, for understanding disease mechanisms, for stratifying the population who are likely to be responsive to a drug, and so on and so forth. So on one hand, for most of what we need, we can find the data. The question that remains, would it be representative of your population? Is it a good thing that majority of the US pharmaceutical companies are developing the drugs based on the data that comes from UK? And this is an open question. And again, even if you look within the United States, the data is not uniformly distributed around the country. Most of it comes from the coasts, and the middle of the country is not sufficiently represented. And another question that really depends on the tool is, if we are training, and we've seen it, it's kind of really surprising that we develop a tool that can look at your CT and predict with very high accuracy your likelihood of developing lung cancer. We trained it on the data that was collected in the United States, but we tested it across the world, like in Asian countries, in India, in Croatia. It seemed to work very well. And the reason I'm was so surprised, because in the US, the only people who actually scan for lung cancer are very heavy smokers. While in Asian countries where lung cancer is more prominent, you test it on non-smokers. And in this case, it worked. But there are other cases where you make some change in the population and tools stop working. So it really would depend on the specific tool and the specific area of medicine, when it is okay to use, some global resources that come from China or from, UK Biobank, and when do you have to develop something which is kind of closer to home. There is no theory, but there are a lot of evidence, where it works and where it doesn't. But again, in my ideal world, we will have capacity to acquire the data which is closer to home.
Thank you, Regina. Glenn, is there anything you'd like to add to that? It's kind of a loaded, kind of $6 million question.
Yeah, so we go into this some depth in the course, but I'll just say this, that you can get a lot of trouble for HIPAA violations. And there have been, like, for example, there's a lawsuit against Google and the University of Chicago. It was ultimately dismissed, alleging, and that sort of interesting theory, part of the theory was they've stripped everything but the time of day as the identifier in the service. So you went to see an oncologist at 4:15 at the University of Chicago. Well, because people have Android phones and Google also holds information about geolocation, you put those two things together, and now suddenly you can triangulate, at least in theory, some significant data. So some of this can get tricky. And as you suggest in your question, Manuel, the GDPR rules versus the HIPAA rules versus the rules elsewhere in the world, quite different. And so as you think about this, even building a product, are you going to be able to sell it elsewhere? What kind of additional regulatory approvals? And lots of complications and interesting questions here. And we do engage some of it in the course.
So it's great, actually. We have a series of questions kind of coming, flooding in. So I think if it's okay with you both, we'll take a few more before we kind of get kind of closer to some closing, kind of concluding comments. I have to kind of call out Ludovic from Geneva. He's kind of sent us an intriguing kind of a catalogue of questions. So that's fantastic. And one of the great things about the questions is there's a section, Regina, that applies to you, and then kind of one very explicitly to Glenn as well. So we'll start with Regina, Glenn, if that's okay. So okie dokie. So they're pasted in two parts here. Let me see if I can kind of get this correct. So to begin, very good. Thank you for that. So for Professor Regina Barzilay, with regard to AI in clinical application, how, Regina, do you see generative AI tools being used in clinical decision support without de-skilling or overwhelming the physicians? Should we start with that one?
Yeah, great question. 2 points. So first of all, and again, lots of studies that show that, besides the application about like taking notes and other things, AI is still not there. So this is just more on the hypothetical world, what we believe is going to happen. So there are lots and lots of part of clinical profession, and I'm not only talking about administrative taking notes or submitting insurance claims, that the doctor today needs to make a decision when they don't have a good information to suggest a follow-up. Let's say I remember I had some condition and I had to take a drug, and the doctor gave me like 3 pages of possible side effects, and he had no clue which one of them I'm gonna get, so what I should be looking for. And in this particular case, AI would be a great tool that would actually give, maybe some medical history and biological data and other things to say, for this patient, we should really look out for these side effects. So this capacity, like think about Amazon, this is my favorite example, that, instead of the way that you are selling a product to all the women of particular demographic in particular part of the world, now you can propose to me some things that is very, very specific to me based on what I bought in the past, what I didn't buy in the past, what I looked at, and so on. So this AI who can very well recommend to us what's going to happen, how your trajectory is likely to evolve, would be of a great help, because it reduces a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty that currently, neither clinician nor the patient have a good answer, and we just need to take a chance. So this is a good thing. But the second thing, as we all know, that whenever we do over-reliance on AI, it comes with the consequences. And I'm sure many of you notice that because we have now, in this grammar correction in speller, the number of typos that we produce before it corrects, it increases, because you feel I don't need to exercise my judgment, at the end it's going to be corrected. And this is something very interesting of how do you bring AI in without causing degeneration in like core capacity of the doctor is a big question, because, again, AI is not 99.9% correct. So you still need to keep your heart as a human and know how to watch for. And in fact, my colleague at MIT, Professor Barzilay, did this study and saw that when AI gives just explanation, cooked off explanation to the doctors, their capacity to make discrimination goes down. So we would look at these cases, how to ensure that you don't become like this big believer and you still keep your skeptic heart, and you ensure that, you don't not you, I mean, the doctor do not degenerate in their capacity of make right clinical decisions. So this is a great question.
Thank you. And thank you, of course, Ludovic. What we'll do now is let's flip over and kind of pick a question for Glenn, give Regina a kind of a little break, kind of a chance to catch her breath. The question for you, Glenn, is what are the most urgent regulatory blind spot in current AI healthcare deployments that you think lawmakers should be prioritizing?
Yeah, so here's one that I'll say about my US perspective, then maybe I'll give another one more generally. From a US perspective, people are shocked when I tell them the vast majority of medical AI is never reviewed by FDA or any federal regulator, right? So we have a system whereby the way Congress wrote the 21st Century Cures Act, and then FDA's own interpretation of its authority, guidance is only a very small amount has been reviewed, and most of it actually has been radiology, which is interesting. So the result is that, just to say, there's lots of applications of AI that maybe you think somebody ought to take a close look at. And so a lot of hospital systems have been left to fend for their own and do some kind of self-organization. And many of them are doing a great job. But to really evaluate one of these things thoroughly is quite an undertaking and quite expensive as well. So I'd like to see more attention to how information and evaluations can be shared. And there's lots of interesting problems about defamation law, about privacy law, and the like that gets in the way. Thinking beyond the US, though, because I don't want to be too parochial about this, I think that there's a big, so getting the initial evaluation right is super important, don't get me wrong, but understanding performance in the real world in implemented sites is extremely important too, and maybe a harder problem, one that I think less attention has been paid for. So the idea here is that just because I know it's working extremely well in one hospital system does not even tell me whether a different branch of the same hospital will have the same result. And I want to know the fragility of the results. And I want to know over time, as Professor Barzilay was saying, is performance degrading or improving? There's a study, and it might have been the Agasemi study too, where essentially they give the individuals an AI that's objectively bad, that reduces their performance. They take the AI away, and then the physician's performances remain degraded. They don't go back up to where they were before. They actually stay in the danger zone or in the bad zone. And that's the kind of thing that maybe you think, like, I want to make sure that's not happening. I'd want to think about debiasing strategies and the like. So less attention has been paid to that as well.
So thank you. I know that we're kind of grilling you with all of these questions. If we can kind of just another couple kind of to take advantage of this kind of rare opportunity, this great opportunity to kind of be joined by you both. So let's kind of oscillate back to Regina. And a further question from Ludovic. What are the most promising use cases of AI in oncology diagnostics or treatment planning today from your perspective?
Let me just to be factual and give you an example of one of the professional guidelines. So in the United States, there is this NCCN, which is a oncology network that creates guidelines in the area of oncology, which pretty much if somebody, how do you do screening? How do you decide about optimal treatment? Those are standard guidelines, and also insurance in the United States is based on these guidelines. They're considered to be standard of care. So if you look through all the different types of cancer, through all the screening, there is just one tool, and this is a tool that is recommended, that this is considered to be a standard of care in prostate cancer. It's to deciding, whether the patient, like a test for a particular treatment. And by the way, Glenn, this tool is not FDA approved. So it looks like, I think, on the pathology slide, and predicts whether the patient will benefit from a cure. So this is what's going on right now. It's like any patient today in the United States that is treated would have a chance to get AI applied to them only if they had a particular type of prostate cancer. But based on what we're seeing from the performance and many reported results, tools that can improve the accuracy of the radiologists when they're looking at the images, the tools that we developed and others that predict the risk of developing the disease, because in order for the human to see the disease on the image, it needs to be big enough. The tumor needs to be sufficiently large so that we can see it. In these cases, AI clearly is doing better than the humans, predicting, the type of side effect the patient is likely to have. Again, AI works pretty well. And yet another area which is not clinical, but where we see a lot of AI, and I'm sure that many people who participated are aware of Nobel Prizes of this year that happen in the molecular modeling, which is very relevant to oncology, both understanding the disease, mutation, and drug design. That's where AI is currently, leading the way on the kind of frontier of the science.
Thank you, Regina. And it's fascinating and really inspiring to kind of hear your comments. Hopefully as well, everybody, for everybody out there, one of the benefits, hopefully, from today's session is that we're whetting your appetite with regard to the program itself that we're kind of running October 23rd and 24th. So we very much kind of hope you can join us and kind of be part of that experience as well. I'm just really picking up on a number of the comments as we've been going through today's session around a number of you have taken, Regina, your existing online programs, the two that you have with MIT Sloan School of Management. And there are a couple of questions here around the manner in which this 2-day program that we're talking about here actually differs or builds upon those existing programs. So I don't know, Regina, if you'd like to make some comments around the difference or the complementary aspects of these two programs.
So I view these programs as complementary. Mm-hmm. So as we all know, and even when you're teaching at MIT undergraduate class, you have to change year after year the material just because AI changes around you, what it can and cannot do. Regulatory landscape changes all the time. So the program that we are producing in person, we can much faster update it in terms of really bring the most recent things. And like every month, there are new things that are coming that are relevant. So this is one point of difference. Another point of difference, and that's why we were so delighted to have Glenn joining us, that we understand it's really a humongous issue for bringing AI in such a regulated industry as healthcare. Is really to have a leader in the field who can talk about the regulation and what we need to watch for, both as we are providing the data, when we are applying, and our responsibility, and what is the regulatory landscape that changes, from last year to today quite significantly. And the final thing that in terms of the programming, which is different, we actually bring in with us people who are applying AI or participating in creating AI from the local hospitals, that we are doing the study to understand, what were their challenges, what they learned from the process. And, you can obviously ask them to lecture, but it's much more direct way to do this kind of Q&A conversation and to think, about this experience and what we learn from it. And the class, of course, is very interactive. There are a lot of exercises and breakout session to ensure that you're not only getting the data, but also very actively thinking about how to introduce it. And you are very engaged learner with other professionals, which range from, clinicians, hospital leaders, regulators, and so on. So it's really learning not only from us and from the ones from, the instructors in the class, but really learning from each other.
And having had the kind of the privilege of kind of seeing how you've designed kind of these respective programs, what strikes me as well, building on your comments there, is the MIT kind of nature of the in-person programs as well, around the mens at manus, the application-based education kind of quotient. As you say, actually bringing in the people, bringing in the topics that are kind of most relevant today to our stakeholders and the participants. It's great to be able to do that. So conscious of time, very, very pleased for all the questions that have been kind of shared with us today. I think we've arrived at the point where I'm going to prompt, no pun intended, but kind of prompt you both for some closing comments. What would be the one thing that you'd like, based on the conversation today, based on the topic area, what's the one thing you'd like people to leave this session with kind of having top of mind? And I'll point to you first, Glenn. Kind of what's the one thing you'd particularly like people to take away, and then Regina will do the same.
So I hope I haven't come across as a downer. As a lawyer, I sometimes do. I am wildly optimistic about this development in technology. We've had several, AI revolutions and AI winters follow, but I think this one in healthcare really is here to stay. So optimism is one. But the second is just to say, it can only do what it's appropriate to do. So when you're thinking about a problem, people who say, I start with all this data, let me just try to make something of it. No, if you're trying to solve a problem, you have to think all the way through to whether you can get the data you need and whether you have the person power, the design, the wherewithal to be in it for the long term. So just kind of that systems thinking and thinking about this more elongated process, what I'll probably leave people with.
Excellent, thank you.
So I would like to summarize from what I've had from students who already took the first version of the class this spring, and what we've had, and we read in their comments, that they feel empowered after the class. Many of these people are not from technology areas. They study, statistics or algebra, maybe in high school, which was quite some time ago. And this fear and anxiety and feeling that something foreign that comes to you and, you need to deal with it. They came with an idea that, first of all, they understand, they're empowered, they can not only utilize it, but they can actually in their organization lead the change and contribute to the adoption. And this is something that, this personal growth component, but also really bringing this improvement to your organization and ultimately to patient care. So I think it's really an opportunity to learn and not only to observe the change that happens in healthcare, but be the one who creates the change.
I think that's incredibly well put, Regina, and thank you, of course, Glenn, as well. We hope very much we have the opportunity to kind of cross paths with you again on the program and in this topic area again, of course. And the program, as it takes us on that trajectory, that journey from the AI models to that mindset, to the actual impact and the actionable insights that you take away and can put straight into play in your organizations. We hope that they actually build not just the capability, but the confidence to go after these kind of challenges, these problems, and convert them into really significant, measurable opportunities for progress. So with that, everybody, a massive thank you for all of your questions, your participation. It's been fantastic to spend this hour with you. A massive thank you, of course, to Glenn and Regina, of course, and of course the whole team who are kind of behind the curtain here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.